My name is Kyle Gleed. I'm on the tech marketing team at VMware, where I oversee the ESXi platform. So anything related to ESXi, be it upgrades, security, deploying updates, things like that. And in this session, we're going to talk about upgrading vSphere. So the standard disclaimer, I'm sure by now most of you have seen this several times. So anything I say related to future roadmap, just keep in mind that you can't hold me to it. Things are always subject to change. So go ahead and jump in. So here's our agenda. I'm going to go over a quick overview of the upgrade process, and then we'll actually get into upgrading a little bit on vCenter, and then we'll talk about upgrading the ESX host, and then we'll get into upgrading the virtual machines. So that includes tools and virtual hardware, and then we'll also get into some recommendations. Now, one of the things I'm going to focus on here is with 5.1 being released, and what are the changes, what's new in 5.1, and what are the things you want to be aware of when you make the move. So real quick, I always like to just get an idea. You know, I've been doing this job for a couple years, and a year ago, the big effort was on ESX to ESXi migration, and I always like to kind of get a handle on where we're at. So I just want to get an idea. How many people are still running ESX today? All right, so still a lot of you. So I will take some time and talk about ESX to ESXi migration, talk about the issues that you'll want to be aware of, because it is a little bit different if you're on ESX going to ESXi as opposed to ESXi. So we'll go into all that as we get through the presentation. So let's go ahead and jump in. As far as the upgrade overview, upgrading vSphere is really 4 phases. So 4 basic phases you want to go through. Phase 1, upgrade your vCenter server. You're always going to want to start with vCenter first. You need to be running the latest version of vCenter in order to manage the latest version of your ESXi host or your vSphere host. After you upgrade vCenter, you want to move on to Phase 2, which is upgrading your host. Phase 1 always has to come first, followed by Phase 2. Now, when we get into Phase 3, which is upgrading your VMs, in Phase 4, as you're going to see as we go through this, for most of us, that's going to be optional. You don't need to always upgrade your VMs every time you upgrade your infrastructure, as I call it. So when I say infrastructure, I'm talking about vCenter and your vSphere host. So you upgrade your vSphere infrastructure, and you get that up and running. And upgrading your VMs is largely optional, as well as upgrading the Vmfs volume. So 5.0 is, as well as 5.1, are compatible with Vmfs 3. So the message there really is you can upgrade your vSphere infrastructure with no Vm downtime, with no disruption to your VMs. And we're going to talk about how to make that happen. And we'll also talk about issues pertinent to upgrading the VMs, upgrading tools, virtual hardware, what are the things you want to be concerned with, as well as upgrading Vmfs. Now, we do support an in-place upgrade from 4.0 and above. So that includes both vCenter 4.0 as well as ESX and ESXi 4.0. If you're running 4.0, you can go directly to 5.1. You don't need to go 4.0 to 4.1 to 5.0 or any of those. You can go directly to the latest version. And when I talk about upgrading, I'm going to basically assume everybody's going to be wanting to upgrade to 5.1 because that's the latest version. Just keep in mind that upgrading from 5, whether you upgrade to 5.0 or 5.1, the upgrade process is largely the same, and we'll talk about any differences as we go through. Now, let's start by talking about vCenter. So one of the big things in vCenter 5.1 that we just announced is the SSO server. And so in addition to that, if you go to the bottom of this slide, you'll see that I show 4 different components. And when you go to 5.1, we now have the ability to basically run each of these components on a separate host. So basically what that's giving us is the ability to do some scaling out. So rather than have all the services running on one server, I can now run my SSO server on one host, I can run my inventory server on another host, my vCenter on another host, and my web server on another host. So it helps with scalability, helps me distribute that load across multiple hosts. So with that, we have really 2 types of configurations that you're going to need to consider when upgrading or installing 5.0. And that is whether or not you're going to do what we call a simple install. And a simple install is basically where you run all these components on the same host. That's going to work fine for smaller environments where you don't have a lot of objects and your environment's relatively small. Co-locating all these services on the same host works. And we actually have what we call the simple install. So if you can see the screenshot there, when you you put the vCenter media in, the DVD in, you run the auto run, you'll see the first option there is to run a simple install. Essentially what that simple install is basically saying we're going to install all these components on the same host. We're going to co-locate everything. In the context of an upgrade, if you're upgrading an existing server where all the components are co-located, you can go in and choose this option, and as part of the upgrade, the first step it will do is install that SSO server. You do need to install SSO for 5.1. It is required, and it's a new component. And then it will go in, after it installs SSO and instantiates that SSO instance, it will then proceed to upgrade the inventory service as well as the vCenter service. The simple install does not include the web service. You'll have to install that as a separate step after you complete your simple install. Okay. Conversely, you have the advanced server configuration where you're running these components on different hosts. If you're going to go with that advanced configuration, the thing to keep in mind is you're going to need to basically, you won't use the simple install. What you'll do is you'll go out and upgrade each component, install each component separately or upgrade each component separately. And you will start with the single sign-on server, and then you'll move on to the inventory service and the vCenter server. You'll need to follow those in order. And then you'll finally, after you get vCenter upgraded, you'll install the vSphere client. So SSO is new. We make it easy for smaller environments with the simple install. If you're at advanced configuration, you're going to want to pay attention to the order, and you're going to need to go through and install each component individually. So you want to keep that in mind. So like I said, the SSO server is new, and it's going to be the first step in any upgrade or any installation. Once you install the SSO server, it can be used with vCenter 5.0 and higher. And again, you'll need to choose your deployment scenario. Now, one thing to keep in mind is with vCenter 5.1, we support SQL 2012. But with the SSO, we do have to have a database with SSO, and it does not support 2012. So just keep that in mind, a little bit of a discrepancy there. So while vCenter does support it, the SSO supports 2005, 2008, as well as Oracle 10G and 11G. When you install SSO, it will create an admin account by default. As we see there, admin as system-domain. This user is created, and you use this user to go in and configure SSO. Important thing to understand is that user does not have any vCenter privileges. So if you log in as this user, you'll be able to administer SSO, but you won't be able to manage any vCenter objects by default unless you go in and assign those privileges. Anybody here running the vCenter server appliance, VCSA? I got a couple of hands. Okay, so you're running the VCSA. Just keep in mind that the single sign-on is bundled as part of the VCSA. When you upgrade the vCenter server appliance, I actually have a slide later on. We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. One thing to keep in mind, too, is we actually moved the vCenter server appliance now uses a vPostgres database as opposed to the DB2, which was in 5.0. That change actually took place in 5.0 Update 1. So a lot of people like to know what the underlying database is, so I just kind of throw that out. In addition, the vCenter inventory service, you'll need to upgrade that. In 5.0, we actually gave you the ability to run the vCenter inventory service on a separate host with 5.0. So if you took advantage of that, when you go to 5.1, you'll upgrade it. The thing to keep in mind here is if you're running vCenter 4.x, 4.0, 4.1, you will need to make sure you install the inventory service separately if you're doing that advanced installation. Remember, the simple install will install everything for you. So pretty straightforward in the sense that once you understand what's new and you understand the order, the upgrade is pretty straightforward. Now, one thing I want to take a minute about is talk about is the new web client. So this, obviously, we're very excited about this. This is new in 5.0. We had the web client in the 5.0. It's new in 5.1. We had the web client in the 5.0 release. It was limited, primarily focused on VM operations. With 5.1, it's now a full-featured web client, and it really is meant to replace the vSphere, the traditional vSphere client, the C# client as we call it. One thing to keep in mind is you will find as you go forward with 5.1, you will find that some functionality, the new functionality, is only available through the web client. So for example, the new improved vMotion capability. So we now have the ability, so we've always had the ability to do vMotion, and then we added the ability to do storage vMotion. But if you wanted to move a VM from one host to another, we required shared storage. So with the new vMotion, what we've done is we've combined the regular vMotion and the storage vMotion into a single operation, so you can basically migrate VMs while they're running between hosts with no shared storage. So that's the new vMotion, a new capability. If you go into the web client and you go to the migrate, you'll see the option is there to select the new vMotion where you can migrate both the VM and the data store at the same time. But if you go to the old client, that option will be grayed out. So just keep that in mind. Some of the new functionality is only available in the new web UI. So you'll definitely want to get used to the web client and start using that, especially to take advantage of some of those new features. Another nice thing about the web client is when you upgrade to 5.1 with the web client, you no longer have to worry about going to all those desktops where everybody's running the vSphere client and upgrading those desktop clients. You can basically tell everybody, stop using the client, here's the URL, everybody go to the web browser-based management of vCenter. So that'll help out there as well. Some other tips around upgrading vCenter. So we have to be running 64-bit hardware, 64-bit OS, of course. SQL Server 2012 support is there, but keep in mind that's not for the single sign-on server. That's just for the vCenter. I already mentioned the SSO admin user does not have vCenter rights. A question that comes up on occasion is, okay, if I'm running the Windows version of vCenter, or what we call the installable version of vCenter, and I want to make a shift and move over to the Linux-based vCenter appliance, the VCSA, are there any tools or capabilities to make that happen? There's really no supported tools that we provide. However, there is a fling, and for folks who may not be familiar with what a fling is, flings are basically solutions, products that we written, most of them by VMware engineers, that don't make it into our official releases. But they're still things that have value, or the things we think customers might be interested in. So we'll release them kind of at a use-at-your-own-risk, kind of on the labs.vmware.com website, where you can basically download them and use them. They're not officially supported, but a lot of them are very nice tools that have a lot of neat capability. We do have a fling that's called the Inventory Snapshot, and basically what that fling will allow you to do is if you're going from a Windows-based vCenter and you want to switch over to the appliance, is that you can run it, and I believe it uses Power CLI under the cover, and it basically will dump the contents of the inventory out to a file and then read those into the vCenter appliance. So you can use that to kind of help make that migration if you're interested in moving away from the Windows-based vCenter over to the VCSA or the vCenter server appliance. And again, I mentioned that when you go to the vCenter server appliance in 5.1, it does run that vPostgres database under the covers, which is different than the 5.0. The vCenter server appliance is pretty much the same as in 5.0. It does not support MS SQL, so you have the local database, which is good for 5 hosts with up to 50 VMs. If you want to scale beyond that, you'll need to go to an Oracle database. Once you go to an Oracle database, the scalability numbers on the VCSA are the same as the Windows vCenter server. Okay, so that's it on vCenter. So just a quick overview. The highlights there, SSO is new. You break the components out, and when you install, you'll want to pay attention to whether you're doing a simple install, an advanced install, and make sure you go in order. And also make sure you pay attention to that new web client because a lot of the new functionality is available through that web client, and it won't be available through that C# client. So now I want to move on to the host, and this is kind of more my area of expertise, ESXi, and let's talk about upgrading your vSphere host. So phase 1, vCenter always goes first. We got to make sure we're running vCenter 5.1, and then we go on to phase 2 where we upgrade our host. Probably one of the most common questions I get is, should I upgrade or should I do a fresh install? One of the things I really like about ESXi is it is small. The ESXi image is about 150 meg. And if you include VMware Tools, it's about 300 meg. So it's about 300 meg with everything. It installs very quickly. And also, because it is small and simple, it has a very limited configuration. So I can do a fresh install of a host and get it configured and on the management network and under vCenter control in a very short period of time, maybe 5-10 minutes. And so because it is so easy to install and configure, a lot of people will say, hey, you know what, does it really make sense to upgrade this host? Because I can reinstall and get everything up and running pretty quickly. And of course, the concern here is I don't want to carry any baggage or anything from my old environment into the new environment. I start fresh. There's a lot of benefits. So I get that question a lot, and in answering that and in thinking about it, the answer I'd give you is yes, it makes sense to upgrade, and sometimes it makes sense to do a fresh install. So when does it make sense to upgrade? Well, if you have a lot of hosts. So if you're doing repeat something, if you're going to do a process, and you're going to repeat it, and you're going to repeat it multiple times, you want to look for automation, right? You want to automate that task. And so if you have a lot of hosts and you're going to upgrade them, yes, you can do a fresh install of each host relatively quickly, but if I have to do that 100 times, then suddenly that becomes a bit repetitive, a bit tedious, and it starts to consume a lot of my admin's time and starts to become a pain. So this is where the upgrade really comes in handy. So you can upgrade. When you upgrade, we preserve the configuration and we preserve the VMFS volumes. And it's literally, from a user perspective, an upgrade is about equivalent to a reboot plus maybe an extra 60 seconds. So you're basically going to go through, answer a few questions. The host is going to reboot. The upgrade takes place during the reboot. And when it comes up, it's running the latest version. So when you have a lot of hosts, it does make sense to do an upgrade. So if you have a lot of hosts, I definitely recommend looking at an upgrade because it's going to save you a lot of time, make your life a lot easier. Some factors to consider when you do the upgrade. I always recommend you put your host in a cluster, you use HA, and you also use DRS. And as you're upgrading hosts, you put them in maintenance mode, you migrate your VMs off, you use vMotion, storage vMotion to get the VMs off the host. You take the host out. You want to be able to make sure you have things protected by HA. You want to make sure your mission control and your DRS and things get balanced. You want to make sure you have all those things in place to make sure that as you're doing the upgrades, you don't cause any disruptions. So again, my mindset, the way I think of it is, whenever I do an upgrade, I want to do it as non-disruptive as possible, which means I don't want any VM downtime if I can avoid it. So this is the key to how you can do that. So always make sure you run things in clusters. And use those advanced capabilities as well. Okay, so with that, when does it make sense to do a fresh install? Well, if you've only got 2 or 3 hosts, if you've got a small number of hosts, then yeah, a fresh install works. When you do a fresh install, the administrative burden's not a concern. It's easy to do. It's quick to do. The only consideration you may have is, because you're doing a reconfiguration, you want to make sure you copy that configuration, you have that available so that when you go to reconfigure the host, you have that information available. And the real benefit here, reason why people want to do that fresh install is because of that start fresh kind of mentality of, I don't want to carry any VMFs3 or I don't want to carry any old configuration. I just want to basically start fresh. So that's so it does make sense. There is a place for upgrade. There is a place for fresh install. Really, which way you go is going to depend on how many hosts you do and what's your personal preference. Now, with that, I'm a big fan of the upgrade, and I think because I know what the upgrade's doing under the covers, I have a lot of confidence in the upgrade. I have a lot of confidence that when I upgrade my host, I'm not really bringing any bad things forward. And so what I'm going to do now is actually go through the upgrade, and hopefully when we're done, I'll have instilled in you a bit of confidence so that when you get ready to do the upgrade, you'll think, you know what, I trust the upgrade. I know it works. I know what it's doing under the covers, so I'm going to go ahead and go that option. Okay, when you upgrade, there are 3 methods to upgrading. And there's actually more, but I'm going to talk about 3, then I'll explain the other one. So the Esxi Installer is pretty straightforward. You basically put the DVD in, you boot, you answer a few questions, and the host will go out and do the upgrade. So when you do that, there's an option, migrate the host, preserve the VMFS volume. That's your upgrade option. You can also use Update Manager. With Update Manager, very easy again. You basically go into Update Manager, you import the ISO, you create an upgrade baseline, you attach it to your host, remediate your host, and you're good to go. Update Manager has some benefits because you can actually remediate an entire cluster. So if I have an 8-host cluster, I can attach the upgrade baseline to the cluster, remediate it, and Update Manager will actually go through the process of putting hosts in maintenance mode, taking them out, upgrading them, putting them back, and moving on to the next host. So Update Manager is another option. Scripted upgrades are pretty much the same as using the installer. The difference is instead of you being on the keyboard hitting enter and answering questions, you basically pass in an answer file where you've pre-answered those questions. And so those are really the 3 most common. Obviously the installer and Update Manager are more common. A lot of people who do scripted installs like to do the scripted upgrades as well. Now I mentioned there's some additional options. If you're running 5.0, you can use the Esx CLI command to upgrade to 5.1. If you're running 4.x, obviously that option is not available. In addition, in the docs, when you read the upgrade guide, it will talk about using auto deploy as a method to upgrade. What auto deploy is basically the ability to run ESXi in a stateless capacity or a diskless capacity, where you set up an auto deploy server, and then you basically network boot your host, and ESXi gets installed into memory. If you're running auto deploy today, then yes, auto deploy is a great upgrade option. It's probably the best upgrade option. However, if you're not running auto deploy today, it's not really an upgrade option because it's a change in architecture. You're going to have to change your architecture in order to use it. So I don't really talk about it in the context of upgrade here, but I do want to throw it out because when you read the docs and you read about auto deploy and you read about it being an option, a tool used to do upgrades, you'll kind of know that the requirement there is you have to be running auto deploy in order to use auto deploy to do the upgrades. Before you upgrade, a couple things here. So, I've been doing this for a while, and I spent 10 years as a consultant doing upgrades. Pretty much what that meant as a consultant was upgrades. I'd always get called in to go to customers to help do upgrades. And when I think back of my experience and I think of what I see today, almost probably 85, 90% of the time, when there's a problem with an upgrade, it can usually be traced back to one of three things: either a hardware incompatibility, a driver issue, or a firmware issue. So make sure you do your due diligence, go out to that compatibility guide, make sure you verify your hardware supported. Don't assume just because it was supported in 4.0 or supported in 5.0 that it's supported in 5.1. So do your due diligence there. If you have new hardware, watch out for new drivers. You know, if you need to go out to the vendor and get some updated drivers, make sure you do that before you do your upgrade so you don't run into a problem where you reboot and suddenly you can't see your disk or you can't get on the network. So that compatibility guide, you know, itself, I think this is something we're all aware of, but it's good to remind ourselves because we all, you know, it comes back and bites us all at some point. Basic requirements, 64-bit hardware, of course, and you do have to upgrade vCenter first. We're talking about the second phase. And then the hosts need to be running 4.x or higher. So 4.0 or 4.1, they can be ESX or ESXi. In-place upgrades only. What I mean by that is if you're booting off USB, you can upgrade that USB. If you're booting off a SanDisk, you can upgrade that SanDisk. You're booting off a local disk, you can upgrade that local disk. What you cannot do as part of an upgrade is change your boot device. So if I'm booting off local disk and I want to go to boot from SAN, I'm going to have to do a fresh install. There's no provision to basically change the boot device as part of an upgrade. When you upgrade, this is important to keep in mind. How many people use a custom ISO image provided by a vendor? Okay, so a lot of you do. So what do those vendors do to those images? They take the image from VMware and they add additional VIBs or different software packages. The VIBs, the vSphere installation bundle, is the packaging format we have. So what they do is they take the base image that VMware provides and they add additional software packages on there that do things to help manage their hardware or to help with managing storage and things like that. So if you're running off a custom image that has those additional software components installed, you go out and download the 5.1 image from VMware today and you go to your host and do the install. We do not basically append or go into that existing image and kind of add and remove files. What we do is we erase what's there today and we put on what your upgrade. So what that means is if you're running a custom image and you download the image from VMware, you're going to overwrite and you're going to lose all those third-party software packages. Okay, so you want to watch that. And so because we're kind of we understand that there's this potential, one of the things the installer will do, and this is both true for Update Manager as well as the Esxi Installer, is we will go out and we'll basically do a check and we'll basically scan the host and we'll try and identify if there's any additional software packages installed on the host. If we detect this, we pull up and it actually pops up as a warning, but really it's just a reminder that's saying, hey, it looks like you have some additional software installed on the host. That software is not going to be installed as part of the upgrade, so you're going to have to make sure you account for that after you do the upgrade. So it's really there to remind you so you don't forget to go in and install any optional software packages. When you get in that situation, if you see this warning, you have a couple options. There's two on here. I'm going to talk about three of them. Option number one is you can always just reinstall that software package after the upgrade. So you can basically go out and get the VIBs from the vendor, do the upgrade, and then use the Esx CLI command to install those onto the host after the upgrade. That's one way to do it. The other option is you can use the ESXi image builder, which is basically a set of power CLI commandlets that allow you to add and remove software packages to and from your installation image. And you can use that to create a custom image. So you can go out and get those VIBs, go out and get the VMware image, and you can marry those up, create a custom ISO, and then use that ISO to install. And when you do that, it will make sure those VIBs get included. The third option, which is not on the slide that you can use, is obviously you can go back to the vendor and say, hey, give me the 5.1 upgrade, the 5.1 version of your image, and you can wait for the vendor to do that work for you, in which case the vendor is essentially doing step number 2 on your behalf. So you want to watch that. So if you do see information about third-party software and you get this warning, I just want you to make sure you understand what it's talking about. In some cases, maybe the software it's talking about is deprecated. It's no longer needed and you can safely ignore it. But just keep that in mind. If you go out and grab the image from VMware and you upgrade the host and you use the image from Dell or HP to install that host, just be aware that we're not going to provide those same drivers or those same packages that those vendors provided, and those will be lost on upgrade unless you take the steps to address that. Okay, as far as upgrade tips, I already kind of went over this, a little bit of repeat here, but I just want to make sure, everybody understands it's always, put your host in clusters, use HA, use DRS, leverage those advanced vSphere features, vMotion, storage vMotion. Host profiles is another one that's good to use as part of upgrades, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The question I always get when I bring this up is people will say, wait a minute, I'm only running standard, or I'm only running advanced or enterprise. I don't have enterprise plus. I don't have access to storage vMotion. I don't have access to host profiles. Keep in mind, once you upgrade vCenter to 5.1, you get that 60-day trial license, and you can use that to your advantage. There's nothing wrong with, for 60 days, using that trial license to storage vMotion, use host profiles, and then just make sure that before that 60 days is up, you go ahead and you put in your permanent license, and just be aware those features will get disabled. But you can use them for that trial window. You can upgrade with no VM downtime, and again, the key to doing that is to be able to migrate VMs between the hosts as part of your upgrade, and then rely on DRS to kind of rebalance things so you don't create any hotspots. And then the host profiles, where that comes in the context of an upgrade, is if I have a lot of hosts, say I have 50 hosts I'm going to upgrade, I take the first host, I upgrade it, and I get it up, I make sure the configuration's good, it's now running 5.1, everything's good. I can basically use that as a reference host, create a host profile. And then when I upgrade my second host, I can just basically attach that host profile, do a scan, and I can make sure the configurations match. This is going to help me identify any configuration drift that might be cropping into my environment as I go through the upgrade. Make sure I don't forget to enable vMotion on a certain host, or make sure I don't forget to set some other attribute or some other settings. So host profiles can come in handy as well. So simply just attach them to the host as you upgrade them, do that compliance scan, and make sure everything is compliant. And as issues pop up, you can fix those proactively as opposed to waiting for an HA event to highlight the fact that something was misconfigured in your environment. Okay, so when doing the actual upgrade, I'm going to talk about doing the concept of a rolling upgrade. And so essentially the key here is when you do the upgrades, you can have different versions of ESX and ESXi in a single vSphere cluster. I can mix 4.0, 4.1, 5.0, 5.1 all in the same cluster. I can mix ESX. I can mix ESXi. And yes, this is true. Even if folks may remember when we went to 5.0, we did a re-architecture of the HA. We moved away from the AAM to the FDM architecture. Yes, you can even have 4.0 and 5.0 hosts in the cluster. When you upgrade vCenter, the new HA bits get pushed out to the host. So just keep that in mind. And the reason why we support this is not because we really want you to go out there and for long periods of time run mixed versions in your clusters, because there are some risks, some issues, particularly around virtual hardware versions when running in this, but it's there to enable what we call rolling upgrades. So the way the rolling upgrade works is you'll see here I've already upgraded vCenter. I'm running vCenter 5.1. I have 4 hosts that are running 4.1. I want to upgrade this cluster. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use vMotion, and I'm going to migrate all the VMs off the host. I take the host out, I upgrade it, and then once it's upgraded, it comes back. It's now running 5.1. Okay. I can go on and do the next host, same thing. Go on and do the next host, same thing. And I can basically roll through the cluster, upgrading each host. And as I go through this, eventually I'll have the entire cluster upgraded. Okay. So I mentioned that while running in a mixed state, you want to be careful. Again, the tips here, you got that 60-day trial license if you need it, for storage vMotion, if you need to get things off local storage onto shared storage. You can, the bottom bullet there, when you're running in that mixed mode where you have a mixed versions of ESXi hosts in a cluster, keep in mind that if you go in while running in that mixed mode and you upgrade a virtual machine's hardware version to hardware version 9, for example, and then that host fails, if all you have is 4.x host, you won't be able to start that VM because 4.x doesn't recognize virtual hardware 9. So while in that mixed mode cluster, you're going to want to leave your VM virtual hardware at where they're at, and upgrade the virtual machine hardware after all the hosts have been upgraded. So that's kind of one of the caveats you want to watch for. But rolling upgrades are supported, and they make the upgrades easy. And especially if you're running large clusters, we realize that to upgrade 32 hosts at one time is not practical. So you can upgrade, you can basically use that rolling upgrade to over time to upgrade all the hosts in the cluster. Okay. So that's kind of a high-level overview of the upgrade. Now, what I want to do is I mentioned I wanted to instill some confidence in you. I want to show you what's going on under the covers when you do the upgrade so that when you're sitting back thinking, should I do a fresh install or should I do an upgrade, you understand what's actually going on the box as part of the upgrade and the difference between an upgraded host and a freshly installed host. So what I have here on the bottom of the screen, I have an example of what the boot disk looks like for an ESXi 5.0 host. So has anybody here ever asked themselves, okay, so I listen to these VMware guys, they tell me my hypervisor is 150 meg, but then they turn around and tell me I got to have a 5.2 gig disk to install it. Okay, so the reason why we do that is because if you look when we install ESXi on a disk, what we do is we take the first 1 gig of that disk and we break it into 5 partitions. And that's what you see there on that 1 gig side. So you have a master, kind of a boot partition, which basically is going to point to one of the boot banks where your ESXi image is running. You have 2 boot banks, which ties into the dual image architecture. So at any one time, you have 2 images of your ESXi hypervisor, the current image and the last known good copy. And then you have the core partition, which is used for diagnostics. And then you have that store partition where the VMware Tools ISOs get installed. So those 5 partitions, those are the ESXi partitions. They get installed on the first 1 gig of the disk. We then take the next 4 gig of the disk and we create what's called the scratch partition. Now I'm rounding down. If you add up the 1 gig and the 4 gig, it actually comes to 5.2 gig. Hence the recommendation that the recommended minimum disk size when installing ESXi on a host is 5.2 gigabyte. That gives us room for the ESXi partitions and room for the scratch partition. What the scratch partition is used for is logs. If you actually log on to the ESXi shell, you do an ls-al, you'll see a /scratch directory. You'll see its pointer, and it basically points to where the scratch partition is. And if you go in there, you'll see there's a location for logs. There's also some diagnostics and some other information. It's also an area that it will be used as kind of a scratch pad. So if Update Manager or the installer or something needs to basically have a place to copy a file, extract a file, and do some work, it will use that scratch partition. Okay. So that's the first 5 gig, and then the rest of the disk gets formatted as Vmfs. Okay. Just kind of as a side note here, the minimum space you need to install ESXi, well, with auto deploy you don't need a disk, but assuming you have a disk, the minimum space is 1 gig. If you're booting off of USB or SD, we will not put the scratch on that. Because scratch is an area of logs, and that's a high write area, and because USB and SDs are sensitive to high amounts of I/O, they wear out over time, we will not put scratch on a USB. So if you're going to boot off USB and you're asking yourself, should I use a 1 gig, 4 gig, 8 gig, 16 gig USB, keep in mind, we're only going to use 1 gig. Even if you have 16 gig, the other 15 gig will not get used. We'll only use that 1 gig on those devices. In the event that you install on a disk that's smaller than 5 gig, it will not error. What it will do is instead of creating a scratch partition, it just basically links scratch to var temp, which means your logs are going into memory. And you'll have to change that later on to a persistent data store. So keep that in mind. Okay, but getting back to the upgrade here. So what I do when I upgrade is I'm running 5.0 right now. I simply go and I back up the configuration. I need a place to put that configuration, so I'm going to basically store it on the VMFS volume. So I'll need about 50 meg free on the VMFS volume to temporarily store my configuration. I then go in and I install 5.1. Notice how I don't use the dual image architecture on an upgrade, only on updates. So here I'm actually wiping out the 5.0 image and I'm installing 5.1. And then I go ahead, I restore the configuration and boot up. So as you can see, doing an upgrade from ESXi 4.x or ESXi 5.0 to ESXi 5.1, we use the same disk partitioning. All we're really doing is just backing up the configuration, putting in the new hypervisor, the new version, and then restoring the configuration. So you ask yourself, does it make sense to do a fresh install or an upgrade? Well, really, you get the same thing. The benefit of an upgrade is you don't have to manually configure it because we're going to carry that configuration forward for you. Okay. With that said, if I was running 4.x and not 5.0, if I was running 4.0 or 4.1, that VMFS volume would be VMFS3 as opposed to VMFS5. So that's one thing to consider when doing an upgrade, is you retain the VMFS3, where if a 5.0 or 5.1, that would be VMFS5. We're going to talk about VMFS here in a bit. So that is upgrading from ESXi to ESXi. Okay, so let's talk about ESX. So if you're on ESX and you're upgrading, obviously it's a little bit more involved, because when you go from ESX to ESXi, we're getting rid of the service console. We're going from a 4 gig image with a huge service console to a thin hypervisor that's about 150 meg. And so obviously when we do this, there's going to be some repartitioning of the disk. There's going to be some sensitivity to the disk partitions. And so let's talk about what goes on. But before we actually do the upgrade, I just want to make sure we kind of go over the highlights of what you're going to need to be aware of. So it is going to change the way you manage your host a little bit. The service console is gone, so you won't be able to just SSH to the host and treat it like a Linux box. There is the ESXi shell, and you will be able to use that. But you want to make sure you're familiar with the ESX CLI command. You want to make sure you're familiar with the shell and the SSH. You want to understand when it's appropriate to enable those, appropriate uses for those. There are limitations with the shell. You want to be aware of that. And you also want to make sure you're familiar with the vCLI and the Power CLI. These are the tools, the command line tools that you'll want to use to manage your host when you move to ESXi. Of course, vCenter is the preferred way to manage your host, and so you can still use vCenter. From a vCenter perspective, whether you're managing an ESX box or an ESXi box, it looks and feels exactly the same. It's when you break out to the command line, if you have any custom scripts on your service console, or if you have any other things on your service console, you need to account for the fact that that service console goes away, so what's going to replace that? Okay, so sorry about that. When you do the upgrade from ESX to ESXi, let's go over what goes on under the covers there. So here I have an example of the Esx Boot Partition, the disk partition on the bottom here. Notice it's quite a bit different. I have a boot partition, I have a core partition, and I have a VMFs partition. So essentially when you install ESX, we go in, create a boot partition, and then a core partition, and everything else gets created as a VMFS volume. What we'll do when we do the upgrade is the first thing we do is we go in and we're going to back up the configuration. So just like upgrading from ESXi, we'll back up the configuration. After we back up the configuration, we then go in and we take the first 1 gig of the disk and we repartition it into those ESXi partitions. Now note, we basically take that boot partition and we repartition it. So when you go to the upgrade guide and you read, there's going to be some verbiage in there that says, make sure your VMFS volume begins after a certain sector count. Okay, basically what it's saying is make sure your boot partition is at least 1 gig in size, because we need that first gig to create our ESXi partition table. If it's too small, that means the VMFS volume is going to start too soon, which means when we do that, we're going to step on the VMFS volume and we'd break that. So you got to make sure your boot partition is at least 1 gig in size. So go ahead and take that boot partition, we break it out into our ESXi partition table, and then once we do that, we install ESXi. So we'll install 5.1. We'll go ahead and restore the configuration, and then we just keep the existing VMFS. So you'll notice here there's no scratch partition, and that VMFS is VMFS3 because this is a 4.x box. So because there's no scratch partition, there's no 4 gig region of disk for me to go in and create a scratch partition. So what we do is we basically just create a directory on the VMFS, and we basically create a scratch directory. So if you're upgrading from ESX to ESXi, it's a slightly different architecture under the covers because instead of a scratch partition, you have a scratch directory, but otherwise, it's pretty much the same thing. Is it significant, the fact that I have a scratch directory instead of a scratch partition? Not really, because the important thing is that your logs are on persistent data store and they're not in memory. And whether those logs are on a dedicated vFab partition or whether they're in a VMFS directory doesn't really matter. So as long as the logs are on persistent storage, you're in good shape. Okay, so as far as some information about migrating from ESX to ESXi, I mentioned we do carry forward the configuration. There are a few exceptions. Anything that's not pertinent to ESXi does not get retained. So if you have custom scripts, you've gone in and modified custom startup orders, you've done anything, customizations around the service console, of course none of that's going to get carried forward because none of that applies to ESXi. In addition, the third-party software we already talked about. So if you've gone in and done some RPMs and installed some additional packages, those will be lost, and you'll need to basically either find the VIB equivalent and account for that. In most cases, I think what you'll find is any customizations you've done to the service console really are deprecated. They kind of go away. The need for them go away when you go to the new architecture. Custom firewall rules do not persist. So if you have any custom firewall rules, keep that in mind, as well as any local users. Those are not migrated as well. And any custom disk partitions, so even though you may have other partitions on the disk, they'll get overwritten as well, and you won't be able to access those. So there are some exceptions to the configuration that gets carried forward. If you go into the upgrade guide, there's actually a section where they have about 2 or 3 pages where they actually go through all the files in the Esxi directory, and they tell you whether or not it gets preserved or whether it doesn't. So if you have any questions, go to the upgrade guide, and we'll give you some information. One thing to kind of bring up here as well, when it comes to storage and disk partition requirements, I mentioned that we're going to take the configuration and we're going to copy it over to the VMFS data store while we do the upgrade, then restore it. So we have that 50 meg free on that VMFS partition. In addition, if you're upgrading ESX and you're using Update Manager, you need to make sure that in that boot partition, you have 350 meg that's free. So not only does it have to be a gig or bigger, it has to have 350 meg that's free. The reason why is because when we boot up, when we use Update Manager is going to copy some scripts to the host, and it uses these scripts to basically back up the configuration. And so we basically just copy those into the boot partition. If you don't have 350 meg free in the boot partition, you can upgrade using the installer, and the installer will load it from the CD or the DVD into memory, and you don't have the additional requirements. So just one little subtle difference there. If you're using Update Manager on ESX host, you want to make sure you have that 350 meg free. Okay, so I talked a lot about ESX and things to watch for. Service console goes away, customizations, local users, added software. There's a lot of things you want to check, and one thing I find a lot is when I talk to customers, a lot of people will tell me, hey, these ESX boxes were installed 2 years ago by somebody who's long left the company. I have no idea really where they're at as far as are there customizations. So what we've done is we created this tool called the Esx System Analyzer. This is another fling. You can go out to labs.vmware.com and download. And essentially what it is, it's a Linux-based appliance, so you'd install it as an OVF. You log on to it, you give it your vCenter information, and it will basically go out, identify all the ESX hosts, and it will do a scan on those hosts, looking for issues pertinent to an upgrade. It will come back with the status, green, yellow, or red, and it basically lists it out in a spreadsheet format. And if anything that's red, it means we found a problem that you're going to need to fix before you can do the upgrade. If it's yellow, it means we found some things you might want to look at. Maybe there's some local users, maybe there's some additional software. If it's green, it basically says, hey, you're good to go. So if you're getting ready to upgrade from ESX and you're going to go to ESXi 5.1 and you just kind of want to get an idea of where am I at, do I have anything I need to be worried about, you can use this fling, the Esx System Analyzer, do a quick scan, and it will basically come back and give you kind of an idea of are there any issues you need to be aware of, or are you looking in pretty good shape. Okay, so that's the host. So now let's talk about virtual machines. So I mentioned that upgrading virtual machines is largely optional when you go to 5.0 or 5.1. And the reason why is because in the 5.0 release, we did a lot of work to extend our support matrix. So with 5.0, not only do we support the 5.0 version of tools, we also support the 4.0 version of tools. Not only do we support Virtual Hardware 8, but we also support Virtual Hardware 7 and Virtual Hardware 4. So we basically provide that backwards compatibility. So that means if my virtual machine is running, and it's running VMware Tools 4 and Virtual Hardware 4, and I upgrade to 5, I can continue to run that VM in a supported configuration. So there used to be a lot of ambiguity around whether or not that's supported, whether or not you should upgrade or shouldn't upgrade. So what we basically did is we formally extended the support matrix, and we basically said, okay, here's what's supported. And so with 5.1, we just basically continue that. So we do add a new version of tools, and we are adding a new virtual hardware version, and we do continue to support those older versions as well. Another significant change with 5.1 is we are renaming virtual machine hardware version to VM Compatibility. And so there's two reasons for this change, two reasons that drive this change. Keep in mind, this is just really a name change. And there's two reasons we're doing this. One is, if you look at something that says Virtual Hardware 4, what does that mean? If you look at something that says Virtual Hardware 8, what does that mean? If you're somebody who's been a vSphere admin for a long time, yeah, you know that Virtual Hardware 4 came out in 3.5, not 4.0. And you know that there was no 5 and 6 on ESXi. And you know the Virtual Hardware version 7 came out with 4. And you know that, so it's kind of intuitive. But if you're a new admin, and you're looking at these numbers, it can be a little confusing. So the change to compatibility, so now we basically say this virtual machine's capabilities are based on ESX 3.5. This virtual machine's capabilities are based on 4.x. This virtual machine's capabilities are based on 5.0. So it makes it a lot easier to basically look at a virtual machine and say, what's his compatibility? And from that, determine, how many CPUs can I have? Does he support some of these other features? And that will help you, in turn, identify whether or not you need to upgrade. So if I'm running a virtual machine that's got 2 CPUs and 2 gig of RAM, and he's a web server, and he's happy, and he's running Virtual Hardware 4, I don't need to upgrade that because those requirements are met by Virtual Hardware 4. Okay? So it helps to identify the virtual machine's features and capabilities. And in addition, it also helps to eliminate a lot of that pressure, the latent pressure that people felt to always upgrade. If I'm looking at Virtual Hardware 9's the latest, and I'm running Virtual Hardware 4, holy cow. 4 is a lot smaller than 9. I must need to upgrade because my VM's getting out of date. So we're trying to move away from that latent pressure to, oh, I got to upgrade, to kind of move away, get into this upgrade when required. But a lot of times when you upgrade virtual hardware, you don't really realize those benefits. So getting back to my example of a single virtual machine with 2 CPUs and 2 gig of RAM, upgrading that from virtual hardware 4 to virtual hardware 7, it doesn't buy me anything. I'm not using any of those new features. So I can avoid unnecessary upgrades. So VM compatibility is a name change. And another point about the VM compatibility is you're only going to see this in the new web UI. If you're using the old UI, there's the C# client, you're using the command line, you're still going to see references to virtual hardware. When you go to the web UI is where you'll see virtual hardware is replaced with compatibility. So just keep that in mind. And we are transitioning, so what you will see in a lot of places in the GUI, it will say compatibility 5.0, and then in parentheses it will say virtual hardware 7, or 8. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, now when it actually comes into upgrading, so I just mentioned that upgrade is optional. But when it comes to tools, that doesn't mean it's not recommended. We always recommend you run the latest version of Tools. Tools does so much for you. It ties in with a lot more than just making it easy to move the mouse. It ties in with memory management, host monitoring. There's a lot of things that Tools does for you. So you'll definitely want to be running the latest version of Tools everywhere you can. The key here is if you have 1,000 VMs and you just upgrade your infrastructure, you don't have to turn around and immediately go in and reboot 1,000 VMs. You can continue to run the older version of Tools, but you will want to start planning and identify, the next maintenance window, the next opportunity you'll want to upgrade your tools. When it comes to tools, another thing that's nice is the newer version of Tools. So 5.1 is supported on a 4.0 host. They got that backwards compatibility. So if you're in that mixed mode cluster where I was talking about when you're doing a rolling upgrade, and you go ahead and start upgrading your tools right away, those VMs can fall back and run on the older host in a supported configuration. So we do have that backwards compatibility when it comes to tools. So when it comes to tools, obviously if you're running 3.x, you're going to want to upgrade because we only support 4.x and higher. If you're running 4.x, the upgrade's optional. And if you're running 5.x, it's optional, but keep in mind once you upgrade, it is backwards compatible. Okay. So VM compatibility, aka virtual machine hardware version. It's a little bit different because with virtual hardware version, yes, we support the older versions, but it's not backwards compatible. So once you upgrade the virtual machine to the latest compatibility level, it can no longer run on the older host. So for that reason, when you're running in that mixed cluster state, you'll want to wait till all your hosts are running 5.1 before you start upgrading virtual hardware to version 9 or the compatibility to 5.1. Because that way you don't want to get in a situation where you have a mix of 4.1 and 5.1 hosts in a cluster, and you start creating new VMs or you start upgrading virtual hardware versions, you have an HA event and it tries to fail that VM over to a 4.x host and it can't because you've upgraded the virtual hardware. So you want to keep your virtual hardware at the lowest common denominator while in that mixed state. Upgrade them after all your hosts are upgraded. One note about this, with the web UI and in 5.1 you can go in and define a default. So that if you go in and create a new virtual machine, it will always default to, say, compatibility 4. So that will help you avoid situations where you accidentally forget, create a new VM, and it gets created with the newer hardware version. You can go in at a host level or a cluster level, define a default, and it will use that default. So while in that mixed state, you can still make sure all the VMs get created are compatibility 4 as opposed to compatibility 5. Okay. I mentioned that one of the reasons for the change to virtual compatibility was because we want to make it easy to identify a VM's features and capabilities. So key to that is this information was really not published and not available prior to 5.1. If you want to know what the difference was between, say, virtual hardware 4 and virtual hardware 7, you basically had to go to the release notes and figure it out yourself. I pretty much put this table together based on documentation. So when you go to the docs, you'll find, I think it's actually a web page now, you'll find this information is published and available. So if you see your virtual machines running compatibility 4 and you want to know what that means, you can go and you can see that's 8 CPUs, and if you need 10, hey, I got to upgrade, type of thing. Okay, so now we're on to phase 4. So we talked about vCenter, we talked about the host, we talked about virtual machines. Now let's talk about Vmfs. So upgrading Vmfs, Vmfs 3 is supported with both 5.1 and 5.0. So the older Vmfs is supported. So the upgrade is optional, but it is recommended. And the reason why it's recommended is because you'll notice there's a lot of new features that came out with Vmfs 5. Now, these came out in 5.0, so there are some additional improvements in 5.1, but for the most part, most of this came out in 5.0. But you'll see you get larger volume size, larger number of files. We have a lot better space utilization with regards to how we allocate space, how we allocate blocks, how we allocate subblocks. There's a lot of improvements to come out in 5.0. When you upgrade a VMFS volume from VMFS 3 to VMFS 5, you can do that while the VMF is running, while it's online, while VMs are running. It's non-disruptive. It's very easy to do. But the key is we're only going in and making some metadata updates. So we're going in and making some quick changes so it looks like a VMFS 5, but we're not redoing the volume layout, so we don't get a lot of the benefits. So if we compare a VMFS volume that's created from scratch as VMFS 5 against a VMFS volume that was a VMFS 3 that's been upgraded, you'll see there's a few limitations here. So you don't get the maximum file size, you don't get some of the blocking, you don't get the subspace allocation. So there are some limitations with an upgraded VMFS volume. So for that reason, we recommend, if you can, the best way to handle a migration for VMFS is to go out, create a new VMFS 5 volume, use storage vMotion to move the files onto that volume, and then get rid of the VMFS 3. That way you have all the benefits of VMFS 5. So that's a recommendation, and that works well when you have shared VMFS volumes and you're hosting VMs. Now, if you'll remember when we were doing the upgrade, you had the VMFS volumes on the boot disk. Here, we're not as sensitive to a lot of this. Those boot disk volumes aren't really used that often, and they really don't drive a lot of high amounts of I/O typically. So in those cases, it's probably okay to go ahead and do the upgrade. But if you got shared storage, you got VMFS volumes hosting a lot of VMs, in those cases, if you can, doing that step of creating a VMFS 5 using storage vMotion to move things over is probably going to be recommended or preferred versus just doing an upgrade. But you can do the upgrade if you want. So just keep that in mind. When you go in the web UI, you can see that you go into the data store. There's an option there to upgrade VMFS. Again, it's non-disruptive. It's very quick, very easy. You just want to keep in mind that when you do the upgrade from VMFS 3 to VMFS 5, there are some limitations with regards to you don't get a lot of the improvements that come in VMFS 5. You retain some of those older VMFS 3 attributes with regards to how the space is allocated and laid out on disk. Okay, VMFS 5 upgrade considerations. VMFS 5, once you upgrade a volume to VMFS 5, you can no longer mount it or access it from a VMFS 4 host. And once you upgrade it, there's no undo. So you want to make sure all your hosts are running 5.1 before you do the upgrade. Matter of fact, if you go in and try and do an upgrade and the volume is currently being mounted by a 4.x host, it will basically pop up a message saying, hey, can't do this because I got 4.x host out there accessing it. So you keep that in mind that once you upgrade it, the upgrade's permanent, and you'll no longer be able to mount that by older host. There's no undo option. And also, if you're going to take my advice and you're going to basically create a new VMFS 5 and use storage vMotion to move it over, keep in mind that's going to take some time. That's going to be a little bit of a disruptive operation. You're going to be generating a lot of I/O, so you're going to want to schedule that for low utilization, for weekends. You're going to want to schedule that over time. You don't want to do that in the middle of the day during your peak utilization because you're essentially doing a lot of storage vMotion, and you're going to be driving a lot of I/O across those two data stores as you're moving the data. So you want to schedule that accordingly. All right, so with that, just quick recap here of everything we went over. So make sure, there's 4 phases. Make sure you upgrade vCenter first. Move on to your host. You always got to upgrade vCenter first. You've got to have 5.1 in order to manage 5.1 host. Move on to your host. We support in-place upgrades of both ESX and ESXi, 4.x and higher, to ESXi 5.1. And then when you move on to your VMs, with 5.0, 5.1, upgrading the VMs is largely going to be optional in most cases because we have that backward support. But upgrading tools is always recommended, upgrading the virtual hardware as needed. And the VMFS, keep in mind about the differences between a VMFS 5 versus a VMFS 3 and some of the upgrade limitations there. And I believe with that wraps it up. So here's a blog you can get more information about. I do blog about upgrades and things as they come up, and that's my Twitter handle as well. So with that, I got 2 mics here in the room. They're recording the session, so we'll make sure we use the mics so they can hear things, and I'll take any questions you may have. Thank you.